Thank you very much, Casey. If you do that well with the Navy interviewers tomorrow, you're going to dazzle them. And I am so proud to have been introduced by you. I thank you very much. I am also, I have to say, a little overwhelmed by the size of this turnout at lunch. I thought we were going to have a sort of a small, chatty group here. For reasons that I won't even bother to try to explain to you, it reminds me a bit of an event earlier this summer in Washington. My ultimate big boss, Catherine Graham, had a party at her home for Art Buchwald on the occasion of his latest chapter of his memoirs about his years in Paris. And as you might imagine, when Kay Graham sends out invitations to Washington, everybody, you know, who is not totally disabled shows up to be there. So standing on this back terrace of her home and, you know, looking out over this crowd of bigwig government officials and the entire press establishment and, you know, all of the power brokers at Washington, and Buchwald gets up to speak, and I can't possibly imitate that wonderful sort of Brooklyn tough guy voice of his, but he says, looking around this crowd, he said, I realize, he says, that Dick Morris was right. There ain't anything to do in Washington on a Wednesday night. I have no idea why that reminded me of today. A bit more seriously, let me tell you, I have been looking forward to this day, not just because when we got there it would mean that the blessed election campaign would be over and past, but because coming to the Ashbrook Center has very special meaning for me. I'm of a generation of reporters that got to know and covered John Ashbrook, both as a member of the House, and I remember him very well in New Hampshire in the winter of 1972 when, as a principled conservative, he was challenging the president of his own party's renomination. Because John was always exactly that. He was principled and conservative, and he never saw or allowed there to be any contradiction between those terms, and he insisted on holding everyone, even someone like the president whom he had supported, and I think in many respects revered, to those same high standards that he set for himself and for people in the political opposition. So it is a great honor for me to be here at the John Ashbrook Institute. I also have enjoyed over the years a wonderfully close relationship with Cliff White. Cliff probably taught me more about politics and certainly improved my understanding of what was taking place in Republican politics more than any other individual that I could name. So this is a very special day for me. I would like, as much as possible, to have a dialogue with you here, although the size of the group will, I guess, will limit the number of you who actually get into the question period, but I want to save time for that. I want to talk basically about why I think we are in a time when the task of governing that Ralph Regula and his colleagues, the others here who are serving in local government and in state government, why the task of governing is going to be a very difficult one, because it's something that I think as citizens we need to understand before we are too quick to pass judgment on what inevitably are going to be, I think, the disappointments and the frustrations with what happens in our government. On the face of it, it ought to be a piece of cake to be in government at this point. The Cold War is over. This country is probably as free from severe or serious foreign threats as certainly we've been in my lifetime. The economy seems to be perking along in most parts of the country. We are teaching the world lessons on innovation and how to adapt our technology to market use and reform our ways of production more rapidly. We had a European visitor at the Post just 2 weeks ago who was describing the political challenge that they face in what are in many respects much less flexible economic and governmental systems than ours in making this adaptation to the information age. So it looks as if it ought to be just a piece of cake to be in government. I don't think that is the case, because there are some challenges that we face now to make the changes that are needed at this point if the next generation, if these Ashbrook scholars are going to have anything like the opportunities which my generation and my kids' generation, the boomers, have enjoyed. One of those challenges is clearly in the area of the federal budget and the entitlement programs that drive that budget. What we wrote about, Haynes Johnson, my co-author, and I, in our book called The System, was the failure of two successive attempts, first led by President Clinton and his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and the second led by Speaker Gingrich, to try to get on top of the problems of the runaway costs of health care in this country. It was a record of failure on both parties. It has had enormous consequences. The Clintons' failure led directly to the Republican capture of Congress, and the failure of the Republicans to deal with the same issue that climaxed in the shutdown of government in the end of 1995, exactly a year ago now, led them to face almost certain political extinction until they managed to turn things around and save themselves, as President Clinton saved himself in the 1996 election. But the problem is there. We still have a health care system, both the governmental sector, Medicare, Medicaid, and the private sector, that is largely out of control and is causing serious problems for families, for private business, and for government at every level. You talk to the governors of the state legislatures, and they will tell you that Medicaid is still the biggest problem in their budgets. You talk to the federal officials, and they will tell you that Medicare, Medicaid are still at the heart of the unsolved budget problem in Washington. Beyond that, but not very far beyond that, we face the more serious challenge of how we are going to provide retirement and health care benefits for the boomers as they reach retirement age, beginning now less than 10 years from now. And each year from about 2005 on, the problem will become larger. There will be more and more millions of people in retirement, proportionately smaller numbers of people in the working force whose taxes will have to pay for those retirement and health care benefits. Every serious study, as Ralph Regular knows better than anyone in this room, that has been made in Washington by Republicans or Democrats or bipartisan commissions comes to the conclusion that by the time you get to 2010, there simply is not going to be the money to pay for those benefits unless we are talking about almost literally stratospheric rates of taxation on the working families in the country. What we face in short time, a decade from now, unless we begin to move now, is something we've never had before in our history, which is the prospect of a war between the political generations. At my paper, we do a lot of very old-fashioned kind of political reporting. We use our shoe leather. We go out and walk precincts, knock on people's doors, talk to them in the living rooms, and say, what's on your mind? I was struck particularly this past year by the number of young couples I met who are absolutely convinced that Social Security and Medicare will not be there for them when they reach retirement age and see the taxes that are being pulled out of their paycheck every pay period simply as a drain on their family budget for which they are going to receive no direct benefits. Some point those folks are going to say this is not fair, and they will find a vehicle one way or the other. Maybe not in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but we now have on the horizon a potential of a significant third-party movement in this country that could, in my view, be seriously fueled by that generational sense that this system is not going to work for us and we are being victimized by this process. The second big challenge that I see for the long term, which again will not wait much longer, is a task of basically overhauling our urban school systems and finding a way to make significant additional training available to people throughout their working lifetimes. This is a very unrelenting economy in which we are operating and living now. Most of the people in this room are probably doing very well because we've had the advantage of the kind of education and training that makes it relatively easy for us to adapt. Even somebody as old as I am could figure out how to stop using the old standard upright typewriters and start writing the stories on a computer. But that takes adaptive skills. And the question is whether or not you have that fundamental education that's given you enough self-confidence to make that kind of change is becoming the real dividing line in our society. And unfortunately, there are millions of Americans who have not been equipped by their public school experience or by their on-the-job training to make that kind of adaptation. If we're going to survive as a healthy society in which all Americans are participating in the growth and the progress of this country, we're going to have to come to grips, whether we live in suburbs, as I do, in small towns, as many of you do, we're going to have to find a way to come to grips with the failure and the near collapse of those big city school systems and find ways in our own communities to retrain ourselves over and over again as our job requirements change. If you look at those, and I'm sure we could expand the list of serious challenges that need to be dealt with in this next decade, it seems to me that we have a relatively weak government to deal with that. First of all, the most basic measure of public support and confidence in the government, we have a failing grade in this country. And I'm talking about simply the number of people who assent to the process by participating in the act of voting. Single most basic act of citizenship in a free country. Going to the polls, marking your ballot, making a choice of who is going to represent you and speak for you in government. This year, fewer than half the eligible Americans voted. The lowest voter turnout, I am told, since 1924, and some people say the second lowest in our history since the great expansion of the franchise in the 1820s. That is a reflection on us as citizens, but it is also a measure of the lack of public support for government. The second thing is that among those, the half who went to the polls, we seem to have been sending very different messages. Like most people who had to write something, whether it made sense or not, on election night, I wrote that the message coming out of the 1996 election was that the American people, one, were saying, we don't trust either Democrats or Republicans enough to give them full control of the government. I think Clinton and the Democrats had that for 2 years in 93 and 94. What happened in those years clearly was disillusioning to experience the American public. They turned around, gave the Republicans control of Congress. I think 2 years ago, most Republicans felt, well, we're more than halfway back to power because we know we are able to win the presidency. We've done that more times than not. we've done the tough thing now in winning control of Congress. But it turned out that the experience Americans had with that Republican Congress was not one to encourage them to give the Republicans complete control of government either. So that was part of the message. But the other part of the message we thought was, why don't you folks stop fussing with each other? Why don't you agree on a few things? Why don't you cooperate? Why don't you be sensible and centrist? Well, when people had time to look a little more closely at the election returns, they saw, I think, a little bit more complicated and a less comforting message. It turns out that about a third of the people who voted in '96 were ticket splitters. That's a pretty high proportion. Roughly 15% of them voted for President Clinton and then turned around and voted for a Republican for Congress. And some percentage of those were probably people who were saying to the Democrats, we don't really want you to have all of the power in Washington, so we're going to split our ticket for that reason. 8 or 9% voted for Senator Dole and then voted for a Democrat for the Congress. In most cases, I would guess for the Democrat who was probably already their incumbent, a familiar figure. 8% we know voted for Mr. Perot and then either picked a Democrat or a Republican for the congressional vote. But if you look at the other 2/3 of the electorate, what you find is a picture that suggests almost two different countries going to the polls in roughly equal numbers and sending very different messages. The profile of the person who voted for Clinton and a Democrat for Congress, more likely to be female than male, higher percentages of Catholics, of single people. People classified themselves as being moderate to liberal. The typical person who voted for Bob Dole and a Republican for Congress, richer, whiter, more male than female, less satisfied with the economy, more higher percentage of Protestants than the country as a whole, and quite obviously more likely to describe themselves as being conservatives. When you look at the priorities of these two different countries, it gets interesting. The Republican constituency put its top priority on balancing the budget and then using its savings to reduce taxes. The Clinton Democratic voters give their top priorities to education, Social Security, and Medicare. And here's the one that's most striking of all. By a 2-to-1 margin, those core Democratic voters said that they see and approve a significant and even expanding role for the government in dealing with what they regard as the most urgent problems. By a 3-to-1 margin, the core Republican constituents said government is doing too much already, it's too much in our face, we want it reduced in scale and size. What this suggests to me, is that for all the talk we hear now in Washington about cooperation and comedy and working with each other, within a few months it is very likely that we will hear President Clinton and his supporters on one side, Speaker Gingrich and his allies on the other side, Senator Lott, saying, we are doing exactly what our constituents asked us to do, but meaning by that almost opposite things. So I think we are in for a period of political conflict. The shape that conflict takes on the budget, I think, is going to be outlined by really a double set of negatives or veto powers, if you will. I think President Clinton now has no choice but to follow through on his pledge to keep moving toward a balanced budget by the end of his second term in office, to bring that budget deficit down to the size that can be easily eliminated within the first year or two following his departure from the White House. I think the Republican Congress will hold him to that pledge, even if he's inclined or feels political pressures to move away from it. On the other hand, I think the Republicans, after their near-death experience following the shutdown of government a year ago understand that they cannot push their argument about priorities in the budget to the point that they risk shutting down the government once again. So my guess is that in large terms, the Republicans will prevail in the sense that the budget deficit will continue to come down, and that part of the budget that finances the so-called discretionary programs, all of the ordinary day-to-day operations of government, not the big entitlements, not the Defense Department, but everything else that government does, will continue to be whittled away in real terms, year after year. But within that sector, I think the President is likely to prevail in having his priorities better funded than the other priorities that might be more attractive to congressional Republicans. The last point I want to make is this. Excuse me. The final difficulty, and I think perhaps the most serious difficulty that our government faces, is something that, frankly, I had not focused on at all as a reporter until Haynes Johnson and I got involved in the reporting for this book of ours, The System. What we've discovered and what we've tried to describe in the course of that has been a basic power shift among the institutions in our country. And I guess the shorthand way of describing it is that political parties, both of them, have lost power, and much of that power now has been usurped or taken over by interest groups in this government. Let me say clearly, interest groups are as American as apple pie. In a country as big and diverse as ours, where government is involved in as many facets of our life as our government is, the act of representation involves more than simply pulling a lever on election day. Groups and individuals who have stakes in the government's decision have every right and every need to represent their interests at the heart of the government process. That's been going on for a long time, and it should continue to go on. But what we have developed in this country now is a kind of interest group operation which approaches and really usurps the old role of the political parties. Interest groups all across the spectrum. This is not just business, not just labor, not just the senior citizens, but all across the spectrum have used the modern technology of political communication to acquire the kind of power and role that in the past only political parties had. What these groups have done is gone into the marketplace, hired the best pollsters, the best media advisors, the best field organizers, and they have created what are in effect little political parties. Unlike the big parties, though, which tend to represent broad and diverse coalitions of people, these interest groups, by definition, have a narrower agenda. And the common characteristic of these agendas, whether you're talking about the AARP and the AFL-CIO at that end of the spectrum, or the National Federation of Independent Business and the Health Insurance Association of America, or whatever it may be on the business side, the common characteristic of those agendas is that they are focused on preserving what they already enjoy in the status quo. So they have become barriers to institutional and policy change in Washington. What happened in healthcare, which was our example, but we could have taken any of a number of other fields, in healthcare, the business community shot down the Clinton reform plan, and then the AARP and the AFL-CIO turned around and shot down the Gingrich healthcare reform plan. Those groups are increasingly powerful in our system, and not just in representation to elected officials, but increasingly in our political campaign cycle as well. What we saw in this last cycle particularly was the rise of so-called education campaigns, the $35 million that labor spent pounding on Republican candidates, single issue advocacy campaigns, the millions of dollars that the term limits people or others spent pounding on Democratic candidates. I think when the numbers are added up, we will discover that interest groups spent more legally and constitutionally carrying their message in this election cycle than the Republican and Democratic parties and all of their nominees spent on their own campaigns. So what we have here is a new sort of barrier to the kind of change, fundamental change, that is needed if we're going to deal with these long-term challenges. How do we answer that? This is why I wanted to make this point to this particular audience. The people who understood as clearly as anyone I've ever known in my years as a reporter in Washington how important it is to have principled political parties were John Ashbrook and Cliff White. The only way that we offset the negative power that interest groups now have acquired to block change in our government and in our society is to empower political parties that have clear principles and make them the agents of the needed political change. How we do that is a challenge for all of you as well as for me as a journalist, but I think that is the nature of the challenge that we now face in this country if we're going to be able to deal with these long-term problems that are out there in front of us. Thank you very much. I don't know what is going to happen over the next decade or two. The longer I've been a reporter, the more persuaded I am that we've got our hands full trying to understand what is happening or what has happened, let alone trying to guess what will happen next. But I do think that the challenge that faces us, particularly in the urban school districts, is going to provoke two debates that are going to be uncomfortable for two different constituencies in this country. I think people who think of themselves as being liberals are going to have to re-examine their views about the relationship between church and state, because obviously one of the more successful efforts that's taking place in urban areas in education is taking place primarily in the private and parochial schools, but particularly and notably in the Catholic school systems of those cities. Now, that is a very tough issue for liberals to deal with. The other question that will be uncomfortable for, I think, people on the conservative side of the spectrum is that we have to think about what we mean when we talk about community. I think the forces in this society that are propelling devolution of responsibility from Washington to the states and the local communities are very powerful and very legitimate forces. People really do want to feel that they have a degree of control over the institutions that are important in their own lives and in their families' lives. They want to have a say in what kind of a school their children attend. They want to feel that the neighborhood is safe and is protected. All of these things that go into the quality of life are things that people want to be able to deal with close to home. They don't want to have to go down to Washington to get some change made in their own community. But when you talk about what the community is, what we know is that historically and for very powerful social force reasons, our city boundaries do not, in most cases, reflect the reality of the community. Washington, D.C. has enormous problems as a city. The Washington metropolitan area is one of the most prosperous, thriving metropolitan areas in the country. It happens to be in 2 different states plus the District of Columbia. We are very reluctant, most of us who think of ourselves as being somewhat on the conservative side, to say, maybe the Lord didn't draw those boundary lines. Maybe that's a political artifact which represents in part history and in part we ought to acknowledge straight up the enormous continuing divide over race in our country. And as important as it's going to be for liberals to rethink and re-examine their position about church-state relations, it's going to be equally important for conservatives to say, what is the community of which I am a part, and am I part of that city or am I not? Question is, can we reform the campaign finance system without changing the First Amendment? We can, and Congress may, because they're feeling the heat at this point, pass some changes in campaign finance law that they will call the Campaign Finance Reform and Clean Government Act of 1997. Whether those changes will in fact get at the heart of the problem, I'd be very surprised, because we are dealing really with the heart of free speech issues. The power, the right of the AFL-CIO or the the NFIB or the Gun Owners of America to communicate to their members which members of Congress or the legislature they think have good voting records or bad voting records is exactly the kind of free speech that the founders wanted to protect. That's exactly what it's there for. And I don't know, I think it will have to be a very, very carefully drawn constitutional amendment not to lose more in First Amendment freedoms than we gain in cleaning the political system. Short of that, what you're likely to do, I'm afraid, is further enfeeble the political parties and the party candidates while leaving untouched this growing power of the interest groups to have their voice heard and almost drown out other people in the political process. Well, when I was talking about the weakness of government, I actually have a point in the outline which I, for sake of time, just skipped over. It's a double problem. I mean, this is perhaps the first time in our history when the heads of both of the elected branches of government are facing serious inquiries into ethical questions. The Clintons obviously, and I shouldn't say obviously, the expectation of everybody at my paper who has been covering this story is that we are going to see a flurry of activity from the special prosecutor, Judge Starr, in the weeks and months just ahead. For what seemed to me to be perfectly good reasons, he decided not to bring fresh indictments in the weeks just before the election. But the expectation certainly is that he has other cases that he's now ready to move to the grand jury and ask for indictments. He seems to be following the classic prosecutor's pattern of starting with at the bottom of the ladder and indicting and convicting and then turning those people into witnesses against the next round of folks, and that's certainly the expectation there. But the Speaker is also facing a serious inquiry by the House Ethics Committee. I don't want to prejudge his case any more than I prejudge what the outcome may be of the indictments in the Whitewater and related White House matters. But it's another sort of wobble, if you will, in the system that I think makes it that much harder for government to take on in all of its aspects, for both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, to take on the serious challenges that I think we're going to have to try to deal with. It's certainly possible, but compromises that are arranged by essentially weak players tend to be lowest common denominator compromises. I mean, we had an example of that this year in the healthcare field with the Casabon-Kennedy bill, a useful piece of legislation that will have possibly some benefits for some folks. It provides portability for your insurance if you leave your job or quit your job, and it provides that you can buy insurance if you can afford it, even if there is a serious medical problem already in your family. And those are useful things to get done, but they don't deal with the cost question. They don't deal with the access question, the fact that we now have 3.5 million more people without health insurance than we had when this issue came to the Congress in 1993. So compromises by weak players tend to be lowest common denominator. And what I was trying to suggest was that the test now for government is whether it has the courage and the political muscle to take on the long-term hard choices. You're not going to deal with the entitlement question without aggravating some people. The proposal that just came forward this past couple weeks to ratchet down the cost of living allowance by 1% a year would have enormous long-term budget savings. But what did we hear? First thing we heard was the AARP saying, no, you're not. And Republicans looking nervously at the White House and saying, we'll go out on that limb, but we want to see the president out on the limb before we get out on that limb. The answer to all of these long-term questions is what now former Senator Alan Simpson said a long time ago. The way you deal with them is if you agree to lock arms and go over the cliff together. Because if anybody hangs back and says, let them go, I'm going to stay up here on the top, you never get it done. And the question is whether we have the will, political will, or whether we have so enfeebled this government of ours, and whether the groups that have a stake in protecting what they already have in the status quo have so much power to intimidate our politicians that we never get to those larger solutions. Thank you very much.